Hi, I'm Libby Dankman with KPCC and LAist, here with 5 keys for voting in California. Check your voter registration status and watch your mailbox. California is mailing every active registered voter a ballot this year because of the coronavirus pandemic. But don't go on autopilot. Make sure that you're registered and confirm that your local elections office has your current mailing address. One clue, you should have already gotten some snail mail reminders about voting from your registrar. I know, you might have thrown them out. Mail-in ballots start going out October 5th. If you don't see yours by the following week, contact your county's registrar. Seal your ballot in the official envelope and remember to sign the outside. More than 2/3 of Californians already vote by mail, but this might be your first time. The full packet will have your ballot, an optional secrecy sleeve, the return envelope, and your I voted sticker. Once you've filled out your ballot, place it back in the envelope and don't forget your signature. A rule of thumb is to sign the way you did on your driver's license. There's more than one way to cast that ballot. You can mail it back. As long as your ballot is postmarked on or before Election Day, it has 17 days to make it to the registrar's office. Or you can drop it off at a secure ballot drop box, like this one here, or at a polling place or a vote center. Track your ballot and make sure it's counted. The Secretary of State offers a nifty Track My Ballot service so you can monitor your ballot's progress. If your mail-in ballot is rejected for any reason, usually that happens because of a mismatched signature, by state law, your registrar has to contact you and let you fix it. You can still vote in person. If you need any help with your mail-in ballot or you lose it, no problem. Counties will be operating voting locations with COVID-19 safety measures. In Los Angeles and Orange counties, some vote centers will be open for 11 days. There's even one at Dodger Stadium. Hopefully you have a great experience. If you have any questions, contact our voter game plan team at LAist.com.
So good evening. On behalf of KPCC and LAist, welcome to our Voter Game Plan virtual event series dedicated to helping you get ballot ready. I'm John Cohn, and I manage live programming and events for KPCC and LAist. Tonight, Larry Mantle hosts an AirTalk Cram session on the ballot propositions. This Thursday, Frank Stoltz and James Quealy host a DA debate in partnership with the LA Times. And next Wednesday, Libby Dankman hosts a debate with the candidates for the 2nd District of the LA County Board of Supervisors. You can check out all these events and our other voting resources at votergameplan.com. And while you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter to be the first to find out about all of our events. This evening, we invite you to engage with us and your fellow attendees in the chat section. We'll have a Q&A session at the end, so be sure to put your questions in there as we go. The full video of tonight's event will be available on our event page after the fact, so feel free to come back and cram again or share it with anybody that couldn't quite make it to join us this evening. If you're in a position in which you can support KPCC and LAist, we're always grateful for anything you can do. Go to support.kpcc.org/in-person. Thank you again for joining us this evening. Without further ado, the host of Southern California's longest continuously running daily talk program, AirTalk's Larry Mantle.
A very good evening, John. Thank you so much. And welcome to the AirTalk Voter Cram session, a KPCC in-person event. We have such limited time to talk about so many ballot propositions, just as we've done in previous election years. Unlike our previous years, I'm the only one at the Moan Broadcast Center. It's so good to have you joining us virtually or over 89.3 KPCC. And our format's the same. Contained within this hour, it's a primer on all 12 California ballot propositions. For a number of years now, we've been hosting the Voter Cram sessions and had wonderful attendance here at KPCC in our Crawford Family Forum, and we're going to do our best to recreate that for this special event. Joining me from the nonprofit statewide news organization Cal Matters, reporter Laurel Rosenhall. Also with us, from our fellow NPR member station KQED in San Francisco, political correspondent Marisa Lagos. She also co-hosts the podcast Political Breakdown. He's Loyola Marymount University professor of political science and Chicano Latino studies and director of LMU's Center for the Study of Los Angeles, Fernando Guerra. And also with us from Pepperdine University School of Public Policy, Associate Dean and Associate Professor Michael Shires. We begin with Proposition 14, a $5.5 billion bond measure for the state's Institute of Regenerative Medicine. The Institute's stem cell research funding program was established by voters with the 2004 passage of Proposition 71. Laurel Rosenhall, please start us off. Is this essentially a recharge of Prop 71 and the funding that came with that?
Yeah, exactly. Basically, the supporters are going back to the voters and asking for more money because they've spent up everything that they got in the last round. And I think the most interesting thing to note about this one is that when this funding was first approved in the early 2000s, the federal government was not allowing any federal grants for stem cell research. And that's changed since then. So there is some argument to be made that this kind of investment by California taxpayers is no longer necessary because federal funding is available. On the other hand, supporters say that it's led to a lot of jobs in biotech and keeps the state on the forefront of innovation.
Fernando Guerra, one of the things that I've heard from a critic of this on our AirTalk segment was that there was supposed to be through patents, with funding provided by the Institute, that money would flow back to the state to recharge the coffers of the Institute. That apparently has not really happened. So that's certainly one of the issues here. What for you is central to Proposition 14?
Well, I think Laurel already said it, is that they made a promise that they would be able to come up and have some gains. And really, the rationale for it the last time was that the federal government wasn't doing it. They are now doing this. Now, it is important for California to be a biotech leader, to be out there. So in theory, it's appealing to me, but in practice, they haven't produced much. There's no certainty that they will. The rationale for it to first be on the ballot wasn't there. On the other hand, it is a lot of money to some extent, and people oftentimes put this amount of money based on today's budget. But remember, you would pay over 30 years, and during that time, it'd be less than 0.5% of the state's budget, and it does have the potential for a tremendous finding that could really help.
Mike Shires of Pepperdine, quick thought on Prop 14.
Got to remember to unmute. In the COVID era, with all the pressure that's going to be on budget, really the question that taxpayers need to be asking, is this where we want to focus those $6 billion of our scarce resources? And I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the near-term future, and I think it's going to make it a little harder for voters to say yes to this, even though its intentions and the promise that it has is tremendous.
Again, Proposition 14, $5.5 million bond measure to go to the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine for stem cell research and research on other neurological disorders and illnesses. Proposition 15 would create a split roll on property taxes, removing commercial and industrial properties from longstanding Proposition 13 restrictions on tax increases. Residential property would continue to have Prop 13 limits on tax hikes. Marisa, who's backing Prop 15?
So this has been sort of a long-held fever dream of the left in California. Unions, the Democratic Party, others have really pushed for a long time to consider this. The 1978 Proposition 13 locked in these property rates and was really, I think, before my time, but framed to voters by Howard Jarvis, who wrote it, as a way to keep senior citizens in their home. They were seeing a lot of problems with people at the time really being unable to keep up with inflation and the rising property values and the reassessments on them. But it has benefited businesses. And I think one of the big things that they're going to be talking about or are talking about in this campaign is the fact that there was kind of a loophole in this that allowed businesses, if you don't sell more than 50% of a stake, to keep those same taxes. On the other hand, you have business groups, the Republican Party, others who see this as kind of a slippery slope. Prop 13 has long been kind of a third rail of politics. Nobody wants to touch people's personal property tax rates. And so I think this is really a kind of who's who on both sides of the aisle of business interests versus largely unions and Democratic interests.
Mike Shires of Pepperdine, what do you think is most important about Prop 15?
Well, I mean, Marissa's right. This has been a long-held strategy. They've proposed this several times in different forms. This is the latest iteration. I think they just have very, very bad timing this time around. I mean, if you look at a business environment where small businesses have been locked down for 7 or 8 months right now, and you're asking them to pay $12 billion more in property taxes every year going forward. And everybody says, oh no, it's just the wealthy landowners. Well, all these landowners have leases with the businesses that says, you pay the property taxes on this site, your share of the property taxes. And so this is going to go down to the local businesses at exactly the time they're struggling just to survive, let alone to be able to pay another 12 billion in property taxes. And if you look at California's competitiveness, we're 48th out of 50 in taxes already. I mean, this is a great step to move us to 50th out of 50 in terms of business climate.
Fernando Guerra, on the other hand, voters know the kinds of challenges that schools are facing right now with the extra expenses of COVID-19 and the challenges in having enough state funding to operate.
To me, this is the most significant proposition on the ballot. The first time I ever voted for governor was 1978, and I voted against Proposition 13, and my father, very liberal, but a retired homeowner, voted for it. It was conflict. And you think there are discussions right now between Trump, Biden supporters in the household. That's what it was like back in 78 in terms of Proposition 13. In addition, Proposition 13 in 1978, I think all the way to 2003 with the recall of Governor Davis, was this conservative regime that solidified a lot of their policy goals through the initiative process. In the last couple election cycles, you've seen Democrats, unions, liberals start chipping away at that. And this is one of those. And then the next one that we're going to talk about, very significant, has tremendous impact for the future of California.
We're talking about Proposition 15 on the voter Cram session. We're going in numerical order with each of the ballot propositions, joined by Fernando Guerra of Loyola Marymount, Mike Shires of Pepperdine University, Marissa Lagos joining us as well, Lauren Rosenhall of Cal Matters, Marissa of KQED, as we talk about these important ballot propositions, so complex, and we're taking them, giving you a little primer on each one of them. Next up is Proposition 16, which would repeal the 1996 voter passed Proposition 209. That measure banned the use of racial or ethnic preferences anywhere in state government, including state higher education. Prop 16 would allow the use of racial and ethnic considerations in California's public sector. Laurel, this has been a longtime goal of progressives, just as Fernando was saying, for more than 20 years. And I'm wondering if the racial justice protests that we've seen over the past several months might well factor into supporters' hopes for getting it passed this time.
Absolutely. In fact, this measure was put on the ballot by the legislature. And in the early months of the year, before the virus hit and before the killing of George Floyd, it wasn't actually looking very good in terms of getting the votes it needed, even in the legislature where Democrats have a supermajority. This is extremely controversial, and it had in the past really fractured the Democratic caucuses along ethnic lines and was not by any means a slam dunk. It was really seen as something that was a question mark. Then, the pandemic happened and this enormous national reckoning over racism. And all of a sudden, this issue became framed as part of that, as a representation of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it really gained a lot of political momentum in the legislature because of that. And that really changed its fortunes, and it did pass the legislature, and that's why it's on the ballot now.
All right, Mike Shires of Pepperdine, this has been an issue in other states and to some extent in California that has galvanized Asian American communities, Chinese American, Korean American communities concerned about what it might mean for college admissions into the highly coveted slots in state universities. How much of a factor do you think that is with Proposition 16?
Well, Proposition 16, as Laurel talked about, really hit at a key time in the policy debate over race in America. Prop 209 was an effort to kind of take race off the table, but it was extremely divisive when it happened. And today, as we talk about putting it back on the table in this even more incendiary environment, it's going to create tremendous energy on both sides of the issue. I mean, the reality is Prop 209 is 25 years old almost, and most institutions that need to figure out ways around its constraints have done so, and the courts have created exceptions. So there is a legitimate debate, I think, about whether this needs to be repealed at this time or whether advancing it helps. I mean, anytime you insert considerations by race into the conversation, it's going to create very strong feelings on both sides.
Fernando Guerra of Loyola Marymount, what do you think about the timing? It does seem to be it's optimal for supporters.
Yeah, race matters. It matters in terms of public policy, but I also like to think about it as from another perspective that's really important in California politics, and this is local control. This initiative, if it passes, does not create affirmative action. It allows cities and other governmental units to pursue it if they so desire. And there's already a body of law, both federal and state law, that prohibits certain types of discrimination based on race that would negatively impact, let's say, Asian Americans. Even though there's a movement for it, there have been 2 polls that have been done on this. Both the PPIC, the Public Policy Institute of California, and IGS, the Institute for Governmental Studies at Berkeley, have tested it, and it is losing. There's still room for it to improve, and I think given the money that they've been able to raise, that it probably is going to pass, but barely. It's going to be very, very close, and it is an important debate that not only America, but California is currently going into it. And by the way, over 40 states do not have prohibition in terms of affirmative action. California is one of the few that does.
All right, Fernando Guerra, Loyola Marymount University, Mike Shires of Pepperdine University, also joined by reporters Laurel Rosenhall of Cal Matters, joining us, Marisa Lagos of KQED as well. Our voter cram session continues with Proposition 17, which would allow paroled felons to be able to vote while they're on parole. Marisa, measures like this have passed in other states in recent years. Is this prop part of a national movement?
I think it really is. And it fits into a broader conversation, both about criminal justice and sort of, the idea of rehabilitation and whether people who have served their time should be allowed to fully reenter society. But it also really plays into the broader conversation about voter suppression and voter rights. We're seeing litigation continue in Florida over their ballot measure a few years ago to restore the rights of felons to vote. What this would essentially say, Larry, as you said, is that, folks in prison would still not be able to vote, but once they get out, even if they're still on parole, they can. And I think that this is something that, again, we see really break down along party lines, and something that I think fits into some of the later ballot measures we're going to talk about too, Prop 20 and Prop 25. California has really seen, after years of tough on crime measures in the 90s and early 2000s, a really changing of the tide. And we've relaxed a lot of sentencing laws. And I think that people who support this would see this on the same kind of trajectory as some of those efforts to really stress rehabilitation and the idea of allowing people to kind of earn their way back into society.
Mike Shires, one of the things that I've heard critics say about Prop 17 is parole as opposed to probation is essentially part of the sentence, and that it's more similar to having people who are incarcerated voting than it is to people on probation. What do you think of that argument?
Well, I mean, that goes to the fundamental issue here, because once you're off parole, you are allowed to vote, right? So it's literally 50,000 individuals who are in that kind of gray space between finishing their prison sentences and finishing their parole time. And so, the question that's out there for voters is, do we accelerate it? 30 states have said that parole is part of the sentence process and that you're eligible to vote after that for the most part. California has that position right now. And this would simply change California into that other column and say, join the other 19 states who say it's not part of that process. But it really is in some ways kind of a lightening, if you will, of the sentence impact, and an opportunity to vote sooner. But it's a very small population.
Fernando, the supporters, one of the things that they argue is if someone is released on parole, it indicates that society is giving them the chance to integrate back in to regular life, and that voting is a part of that whole process of reacclimation to being on the outside. Your thoughts about that argument in favor of the prop?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to be clear, the U.S. Constitution does not prohibit people on parole or felons or even people in prison from voting. As a matter of fact, there are 2 states that allow people who are in prison to actually vote. And so it's really a decision for the state, given the rationale that you want to use. And the other thing I want to take off is what Mike said. This will impact at most 50,000 people. We've got 21 million voters. We're talking about 0.1% of the voters. This is symbolic, important about increasing the franchise of the vote and not having obstacles. California is in the forefront of, they may not be leaders in individual segments, but overall, we've adopted the most inclusive voting rights, and this is a continuation of that. In a real impact, there's no impact other to the individuals. It will not change one single election in my mind, but it's important to talk about that we are an inclusive state when it comes to voting.
Marisa, I was just going to go back to you. Go ahead, please.
Because I do think that I think it absolutely, you're right. We're talking about tens of thousands of people. It is a population that will change over time. So it will capture more than that over time, right? And I think one thing to think about is we know from young voters, from anybody who has been disenfranchised, that reenfranchisement can really kind of build on itself. So if you have people working as part of the parole process to register these folks, they're probably more likely to vote than if they had just served their parole and then been left up to their own devices. I think that this gets to some really key questions, as I said, about kind of how do we view both prison time and parole, and some of the problems we've seen in the past with parole really being used as a way to just get people back in prison if they kind of step out of line, even if it's minor. And so I think that what this could do more than the sheer numbers of voters is kind of encourage a different subset of the population and even potentially their families to become more civically engaged. And, some people may think that that's not a great thing if they've been convicted of violent crimes. But as both Mike and Fernando said, we already do let people who are off parole participate.
It's Marisa Lagos of KQED, our fellow NPR member station in San Francisco, where she's political correspondent. Laurel Rosenhall of the nonprofit statewide news organization Cal Matters also with us. And we're so pleased to have from academia, Mike Shires of Pepperdine University, and from Loyola Marymount University and the Center for the Study of Los Angeles, Fernando Guerra. Our voter cram session taking you through each one of the ballot propositions numerically. We move on to Proposition 18, a state constitutional amendment that would allow 17-year-olds to vote in primaries and special elections if they're going to turn 18 by the next general election. Laurel, flesh this out a little bit for us.
Yeah, this is actually a perfect building on the conversation we just had about the ballot measure that would let people vote if they're on parole. This is another sort of incremental, small expansion of the electorate. That's the goal here. And I think that both of these measures reflect the Democratic Party's value on bringing in as many voters as possible. And we know that the voters who tend to vote less, whether they're younger, whether they have a criminal history, or if they rent their homes instead of own them, those are the voters who also tend to vote for Democrats. So there is a very kind of neat political alignment with an agenda to sort of expand the pool of voters by Democrats and to restrict it by Republicans, as we've seen in red states, many different policies that sort of attempt to restrict who can vote. So this one in Proposition 18 doesn't have a very robust opposition campaign in California. There are a couple of groups, voter integrity groups and anti-tax groups that are opposed to it, but there's absolutely no money going into a no campaign. And this also was put on by the legislature. So that's a little bit about that one.
Okay, very good. Fernando, both you and Mike know a lot about young people being
Yeah.
college professors. So I assume on campus there's a lot of support for this idea.
Oh, absolutely. Students have been talking about it. Number one, people say, well, wait a minute, you're 17. Doesn't the Constitution require that you be 18? Remember, we're not talking about the November election. We're talking about the primary in California. And remember, primaries are controlled by states and by parties. We can make the rules that we want. It's not about the the November election. Again, it's about expanding the franchise, educating. We already allow 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register so that when they turn 18, they can vote. It's about really preparing our kids to be active, proactive citizens and contribute to society.
Mike Shires.
You know, I think that this whole conversation is, about boundaries, about when you have the full rights of citizenship, whether it's the convicted felons we saw in Prop 17, where it's like, when have you served your sentence? When have you done your debt to society? And this one, I mean, 17-year-olds are not allowed to sign binding contracts. They can't consent to a whole range of activities. I mean, they are not full-fledged members of our society. And I think that it's a little disingenuous to say, well, Republicans are trying to suppress the vote and Democrats are trying to encourage the vote. I mean, there is a point where you reach full citizenship in this country, and that happens at the age of 18 when you can be drafted and when all kinds of other things can happen. And so I think that, as you start carving around the edges and saying, well, we want more people to participate, it has to do when you have the maturity and the legal responsibility and the legal obligation to participate. And I think that, the characterization of Republicans is saying voting is the most important thing we do as citizens. We want to make sure that the people who do it are being treated fairly across the board, and that the people who are voting are the people who are supposed to, and that, if you're going to be voting, you are in fact a full adult making these decisions. I don't think those are just arbitrary things. That's how we've structured all of the rest of our society.
I actually don't disagree with Mike. And
real quickly,
that's my
Fernando.
whole point, that in November, you will be 18 and voting. And if you didn't vote in the primary, all of the decisions have been structured for you. And so your right as an adult 18-year-old in November will have been greatly impacted by what happened in March. And so it seems only fair that you, as a full adult citizen in November, have the right to shape those choices in this entire election. The election is not just November, it's the entire primary season. And that's the rationale.
All right. Gentlemen, thanks very much. That's Fernando Guerra of Loyola Marymount University, Mike Shires of Pepperdine University, and also joining us, journalists Cal Matters, Laurel Rosenhall, KQED San Francisco, Marisa Lagos. Next up on our voter cram session, 1 hour to go through all of the ballot propositions, is Proposition 19, which has a few components to it. It would allow Californians over 55 or disabled to transfer their Prop 13 property tax basis, so that restricted lower property tax basis, to a new property when they move. It would also establish a fire protection services fund. And Marisa, it's also designed to end the ability of heirs to inherit a lower Prop 13 tax basis along with the family property if they don't move into that property and live in it. So this rather complicated ballot prop.
Yeah, and I think that last point is really what makes it controversial, or most controversial. A lot of counties actually already allow seniors to transfer their lower rates if they buy a house within that property or within that county, or if they are going to a county that allows those types of transfers. So there is a kind of limited ability to keep those low rates. And generally what realtors will say, downsize your home. So one of the arguments for this by the realtors and others is that people are kind of in these golden handcuffs, that they have to stay in their bigger houses even after they're retired and their kids have gone away, because they can't afford a new house and the higher property tax rates. But I think that question of whether you can keep the lower rate if you inherit something is really what's making this controversial. Howard Jarvis Tax Association, who wrote Prop 13 originally. That is their kind of biggest beef with this. They see it as a slippery slope. It also, as you mentioned, applies to wildfire and disaster victims, which I think is increasingly an issue that Californians do need to worry about right now, because a lot of people have had these fires sweep through their homes in both Southern and Northern California and can't afford to or don't want to stay put. This is something the realtors would love to see passed. They are the main proponent of this. It is something that we had in a slightly different manner. Were asked in 2016 and did reject. I think that it's another one. It does tie back to Prop 13. And anytime you talk about property taxes in California, it gets a little bit controversial.
It's like religion in California. Yeah. Mike Shires, the Los Angeles Times did, I think it was a series of stories, or maybe just one long one, that looked at some of these incredibly expensive properties that had passed down to the heirs who didn't live in them, and they had taken their parents' lower property tax basis from Prop 13. It seems to be that that sort of reporting is one of the big fuelers of this ballot measure.
Sure, and the voters in 1986 when they passed Prop 58 said, as a form of inheritance, you can pass the house to your kids and they can hold on to it. And that's basically the premise behind giving them the lower rate, is that you're not forcing them, because the property taxes would revalue to suddenly have to pay more. And so, that was the commitment, that was the decision then. We may get a different decision in this election, but it was really about this kind of, you should be allowed to leave your house to your kids and they shouldn't have to get rid of it right away. Now, ideally, would you want them to move into it and live in it? Possibly, but it should be a decision they make on their own time, not one forced by the economy. There's another footnote to this and to Prop 15 that people don't talk about, which is counties don't have the infrastructure anymore to do this stuff. So when you talk about Prop 19 or you talk about Prop 15, the counties are going to have to invest literally tens of millions of dollars to create the assessment infrastructure that we have let go away since Prop 13 passed in 1978. And so there's a real cost associated, especially on the front end of this, that in many cases will probably wipe out any increases in revenues for at least the first few years.
That's something I have not heard brought up in relation to Prop 19. Fernando, your thoughts about this measure?
So I know I try to be as objective as possible, but I'm a tenured professor, so I'm just going to say it. This is a terrible idea. This is basically Robin Hood in reverse. It's taking from future generations and giving it to rich people, people who own property right now, who have benefited from Proposition 13 for years, sometimes decades, and now we're giving them even more money. So if you have a home, it's got a lot of value, you can sell it, pay a little tax. You're going to downsize anyway, instead of taking from future generations. Again, the previous ballot that we talked about was about empowering young people. This takes away from future generations, and I agree with everything that Mike said as well.
That's Proposition 19 on our voter Cram session. Fernando Guerra of Loyola Marymount University, Mike Shires of Pepperdine University, Marisa Lagos of our fellow NPR member station KQED, and Laurel Rosenhall joining us from CalMatters, the statewide nonprofit news organization. Next on our voter Cram session, Proposition 20, which would make changes to previously passed criminal justice initiatives, Prop 47 and Prop 57. Prop 20 would allow the charging of a third theft worth $950 or less as a felony. Currently, taking property of $950 or less is a misdemeanor, regardless of previous convictions. Laurel, it would also remove some categories of crimes that became eligible for earlier release under Prop 57. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, this one is really about some criminal justice reforms that former Governor Jerry Brown championed, and frustrations by many in the law enforcement community that they have had really negative impacts in our communities. So this is an attempt to sort of unravel some of the changes that Jerry Brown supported. So no surprise, he is putting some money into the no campaign on this one. He is on the no side. Governor Gavin Newsom is also on the no side. And the yes side is mostly law enforcement district attorneys and some of the more moderate Democratic members of the legislature.
Marisa, you've also done a fair amount of coverage of Proposition 20. Would please add some to it, because there's a lot going on here.
Is, and I think this is in a way sort of a grab bag of the things that police officers in particular, Jim Cooper, Democratic Assemblyman, helped write this. He's a former police officer. It is essentially a real effort to tighten some of the reforms that have led to tens of thousands of people leaving prison and jails early. The folks against it are very concerned about the fact that some of the provisions of those earlier measures directed the state to take savings from lower incarceration rates and put those back into things like victim services, crime prevention, and rehabilitation. And so what they're saying is that this would essentially undermine some of the progress that California has made around those issues, that it'll take money away from survivors of crime. You really do have, I think, a sort of war of words here, because it's very hard to parse out exactly how one part of a criminal justice change impacts broader crime rates. There has been an uptick in property crimes in California over the last decade, but that we've seen a lot of those similar trends nationally where they haven't had the same reforms. And so, this is definitely another one that has kind of come down largely along party lines of those laurel notes. Folks like Jim Cooper are on the more moderate side of the Democratic Party in supporting this.
Fernando Guerra, one of the supporters I know are the supermarket chains, because theft has been a significant problem for them, and often my understanding is police reports they don't even bother with in many cases when it's less than $950 because of the misdemeanor status, and no one does any time for it. So Fernando, what's your sense of whether that's going to have resonance with voters, and that argument that was a loophole in earlier props?
No, this is definitely a kind of return of the empire in terms of the criminal justice reform that have been happening. Two major comments that I have. One is, if you really take a look at their argument and you try to find the data there is not really supportive. And then I also believe, and a good thing that you brought it up, it's really been pushed a lot by the supermarkets. And, they're really taking a real blunt instrument to a very specific problem. They can spend their own money for more security and more prevention policies. They're asking us, the residents and voters of California, to solve their problem, and to solve their problem in a very draconian way. It's kind of very upsetting that a sector would do this. Solve your own problems, spend your own money if you're having issues. Don't expect us to do this for you. I don't expect that this will pass. I mean, I'd be shocked if it were passed.
Mike Shires?
Oh, sorry. Can I just add one quick thing?
Yeah, sure, Marisa. Yeah.
Noting that you're right. I think a lot of police officers have thrown up their hands in frustration and decided on their own not to write reports. Mm-hmm. And if you talk to district attorneys on the left, on the more progressive side, who do support the reforms we've had and oppose this measure, they say, I have the power to, if somebody continues to come in and commit the same crime over and over, even if they hit that lower dollar threshold, I could charge them with serial theft and that would be a felony. So I do think some of this has been sort of gamed within law enforcement when they have been unhappy with some of the outcomes of what voters in the legislature have passed.
Mike Shires, your thoughts on Proposition 20?
Yeah, I think a lot of the opposition to this initiative focuses on the supermarket part of this. Yeah. But I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here. Things like saying, date rape and selling children for sex should be felonies, period, right? And I mean, this is a backlash not just against a small few things. And I mean, part of the reason why you may not see data, for example, on whether it has an impact on shoplifting is because they're not writing the reports, right? But it's a broader question of, have we gone too far with sentencing reform, or with charging reform in many ways, charging people for crimes? And has that undermined our law enforcement's ability to keep order in the community? And this is kind of a mishmash of issues and topics that have been thrown together to try and give law enforcement more tools. Is it the right mix? I mean, I think this is the kind of stuff that belongs in the legislature, right, where they can sit down and have long deliberations. I'm a big fan of the initiative process, but this is one of the initiatives this year that I think, this really does belong in the halls of the legislature, where these things can be nuanced and in the hands of judges and district attorneys working together to come up with good guidelines.
All right, we're talking on our voter cram session about all the ballot propositions one by one. Mike Shires of Pepperdine University just speaking. Prior to him, Fernando Guerra of Loyola Marymount. Also with us, Marisa Lagos of KQED NPR member station San Francisco, and Lauren Rosenhall joining us from Cal Matters, the statewide nonprofit news organization. Proposition 21 would allow local governments to extend rent control to many more properties than they can currently. Currently, single-family homes and housing completed since 1995 are exempt from rent control. Also, landlords are allowed to charge new tenants at higher rates currently under California law. Marisa, how is this different than the rent control measure that was defeated a couple of years ago?
It's not really. This is kind of a second go by Michael Weinstein, who you in LA are very familiar with, head of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, which provides low-cost prescription drugs to HIV and AIDS patients. Weinstein himself has become a real flashpoint in this. He's a very controversial figure, very outspoken, has gone after Democrats on some of the housing things. It's a little confusing in some ways what his full politics are on some of these. But the issue itself is something that a lot of folks within the legislature on the left flank have tried to push and have failed there, which is this repeal of a state law called Costa-Hawkins that really limited what local governments could do. So in a place like San Francisco, we had a pre-existing rent control ordinance before that state law passed in the mid-90s. So we have been allowed to keep rent control. But jurisdictions who have wanted to increase renter protection since 1995 have essentially been barred from doing so. So this would remove that. And it's controversial because rent control is controversial. People, have very strong feelings on both sides about whether it actually helps tenants or hurts them or can kind of hurt housing production at a time when California obviously needs to do more. And, this is really one that I think people have very sort of strong, visceral feelings around rent control. And I think the only kind of twist here is Weinstein's involvement in the fact that he's really alienated a lot of people, even within the Democratic Party, and I think that has hurt his chances to some extent on building a coalition on the left.
Fernando Guerra, your thoughts about Prop 21 and its rent control provisions?
So we kind of visited this 2 years ago, right? And I take a look at the data and the argument from both sides, and they make certain assumptions, and they have very good studies on both sides, but the data is just not clear for either side. And so they both make good arguments for or against. I'm leaning in terms of for because, again, it's local control. So it allows the cities in different jurisdictions to try rent control. And this would then create experiment. We have 58 counties, over 400, close to 500 cities, and we can then put together some different types of rent controls in different types of cities and try and experiment to see what might work. Most cities will not enact it. It did not create statewide rent control. Again, it gives it to the jurisdiction where the locals and local citizens and local conditions can determine whether or not you should have rent control.
Mike Shires, what do you think of the prospects of Prop 21?
Well, I'm going to disagree with my colleague here a bit on this one. I think that a couple of years ago,
it's not the first time that Pepperdine and Loyola Marymount University disagree.
Friendly rivalry.
Yeah, I think that if you go back to where we are in the rent control debate, I mean, a lot of the things that are being addressed in this initiative, the time periods and the limits that they want to repeal, were the result of a legislative compromise between property owners and these very advocates in the legislature, with the full hearing process and the full deliberative process of the legislature. The governor's office got heavily involved in this, and they crafted a compromise that tried to balance those interests. This initiative is literally those same people coming back and saying, we didn't get what we wanted. We want to throw that entire compromise out and get what we wanted in the first place. And I just think, I mean, if you think about the deliberative process and you have property building owners saying, okay, we're willing to go along with rent control. I mean, I think it was a great set of compromises, and this just undoes that. And while it may just open the door to local jurisdictions, I guarantee you in the next legislative session, there will be state level legislation that steps into the holes that this repeal of these constraints creates and tries to make it statewide.
All right. We just need to pick up our pace a little bit here. Next up is Proposition 22, an effort by Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash to keep their drivers classified as independent contractors. Under California's recently enacted AB 5, drivers for ride-hailing companies must be employees of the companies. Laurel, the legislature has already carved out a number of exceptions to AB 5 from different sectors of the economy. What's going on here between the ride-hailing companies and the legislature over AB 5?
Yeah, well, those companies desperately wanted an exemption as well, and they didn't get it. And the reason is that the theory on these exemptions is that they should be given to, frankly, workers who earn higher wages and maybe don't need as many protections as very low wage workers need. That's the rationale of the legislators who support AB 5. This ballot measure is officially the most expensive ballot measure in California history, which means it's probably the most expensive in our nation's history. The gig companies Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, and Instacart have put in $185 million already. And they are up against the labor unions. This is a classic. On the one hand, it's classic, right? Because it's a labor union fight and the lines are very stark. On the other hand, it's definitely on the cutting edge in terms of the kinds of issues that have emerged with technology, with innovation, and with the gig economy. So this fight is really seen as something that will say a lot about the future of what does it mean to work, and what responsibilities do employers have for their employees for things like, sick time and family leave and benefits like that you get if you're an employee that you do not get if you're an independent contractor.
Mike Shires, one of the things it seems that there's a real difference in the ride-hailing drivers between those who do it full-time and those who do it as a side gig, and that might be reflected in their views of this proposition.
Yeah, I mean, this whole question of who's an employee and who's a contractor, it has been around forever. And, tax agencies have had to deal with this. I actually think AB 5 had massively unintended consequences in sectors they never imagined, which is why they've carved out all these exceptions. But to sort of generically say everybody is essentially an employee has created a crisis. And if you think about how Uber and Lyft came into the economy, it's really dangerous to say, we don't want that to happen anymore, I think. I think that kind of innovation that they brought to the market has really transformed how we do business and how we literally get around. And
so you don't buy their argument that they can't, or you accept their argument, I should say, that it's not financially feasible for them to treat their drivers as employees and operate in California?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, the margins, these gig companies tend to run losses to start off anyway, but I mean, the margins are not going to be there to pay the employees and do all these other things. And my fear is just that this whole conversation is going to destroy innovation that we are getting as a result of the gig economy.
Fernando, your thoughts on Prop 22?
Yeah, very similar to Mike's. I mean, listen, we're in the idea that in today's world, we're trying to put all workers into two massive categories. We need new categories, new definitions of workers in this new economy. I think both sides are right and both sides are wrong. And this really should be, again, being that we, the people, have to decide this. This is too important. I know that the judges also had this had an impact with the courts in their decision, but even courts are always backwards looking. Legislatures need to be forward looking. This problem needs to be solved. This does not solve the problem for the California economy. It solves it for one sector, one exemption. And again, it's very problematic with the initiative process.
Yeah. Proposition 22 we're talking about. Let's move on to Proposition 23, the second initiative aimed at kidney dialysis centers. Just 2 years ago, voters defeated one that was sponsored by labor unions. Unions are back with this one. Marisa, what mandates would Prop 23 apply to dialysis clinics?
So this would require that a doctor or a nurse practitioner or physician assistant is on site during these dialysis treatments. And it would essentially require these clinics to seek state approval if they're going to decrease their services. And it also requires the clinics to kind of treat anybody regardless of whether they're on Medicaid or Medi-Cal. This is, yeah, I really sort of wade into the poli-sci professor territory, but I'm going to just parrot something both Fernando and Mike have said, which is like, why are we being asked about this? I mean, I think voters had a similar response a couple of years ago. Yeah. It's very troublesome that such a small group of very wealthy corporations do run these clinics, which are life-saving and necessary. It's also sort of troubling that the unions have taken now twice to the ballot box to kind of try to settle what I think to some extent are reflective of bigger problems with our healthcare system and our broader kind of system here. This is something, that the unions say would essentially make these places safer for patients, and that the dialysis clinics say, similar to their arguments a few years ago, would really require them to shut down some of the clinics in the rural areas of the state. And so, I am not a dialysis physician. And so it is hard to sort of read. I mean, this is just one of those ones, I got to be honest, even as a journalist who's been following this, you're a little bit like scratching your head. I don't know. I'm not really sure what would be best for the clinics or for the patients here.
Thank you, Marisa. Fernando, you want to briefly weigh in on this?
Sure. This is a complete distortion and abuse of the initiative system. This is one powerful group trying to punish another. And yeah, the other group happens to be a multi-billion-dollar industry that makes a lot of money and should pay their workers more, but this is not a way to solve it. Bad public policy, bad politics. It's again, a complete distortion of the initiative process because you have a lot of money.
Mike, you have one or two sentences to add to that.
I have 4 words, what they said. I guess that's 3.
Okay, all right. That's Proposition 23. Proposition 24 would apply new consumer privacy laws and create a new state agency to oversee and enforce those laws. Laurel, this proposition, interestingly, has split privacy advocates. Several consumer groups are in favor of it, and the ACLU is opposed. What are they seeing differently here?
This has to do with whether you have a worldview of sort of building on what's possible and making a change that's very difficult in the face of a wealthy and powerful interest group, which is the technology industry, or whether you want to sort of throw away what we have now and start from scratch with a very idealized version of what a privacy policy could be. It's absolutely turned out to be one of the biggest surprises on the ballot this year that this initiative is a fight among privacy advocates. It's not what we expected, which was going to be a fight between big tech on one side and privacy advocates on the other side. That hasn't panned out. Big tech is being very quiet. They're not putting any money into either side. They're not talking a lot. And the proponent of this initiative, who is a millionaire, which does speak to the point that Fernando made about the money that can go into these initiatives. He put $5 million into this thing, so it's on the ballot. And he did negotiate with all kinds of parties, but it wasn't happening in the legislature. It was happening privately. So there are concerns both in terms of the process and in terms of the policy. A lot of the debate has to do with going into a scheme where we are going to be asked to pay more for services if we want privacy. That is allowed under current privacy law, but is basically reinforced and expanded under this law. And it's one of the reasons the ACLU is opposed. It's one of the reasons that Andrew Yang is in support, the former presidential candidate who sees this as an opportunity to build up some sort of data dividend where consumers can be paid for the value that they help companies create through their personal data. So it's pretty technical. And on the dynamics between the legislature and the ballot, the legislature did pass a privacy law 2 years ago, and this would make some changes to it. And so the question really here is whether these changes are taking things in the right direction.
All right. That's Laurel Rosenhall joining us from Cal Matters, giving us the explanation of Prop 24. Mike, you have a quick comment on it?
It's a mess. Quite frankly, it's another one of those big, messy policy areas, and the resources just aren't there for the average voter to decide if this is a better choice than what's there. And the outcomes are completely ambiguous. And depending on who you talk to, tech either loves it or hates it. And I mean, at the end of the day, privacy is going to be the most important thing we do in the next decade in terms of consumer rights. And we need to get it right. And this probably isn't the right first step.
Fernando.
This is California stepping in because the federal government has abdicated their power and not been regulating this. Just like Proposition 14, which we started in terms of stem cell, the feds aren't doing it. We see ourselves as a nation state, a leader, can have a great impact. That's why we're taking this on. But it's problematic in that once this passes, you can't change it unless you have another initiative. And it's going to solidify some issues that could be problematic.
It's Fernando Guerra, Loyola Marymount, Mike Shires of Pepperdine with us. Also, Marisa Lagos joining us from NPR member station KQED San Francisco. Our final proposition, a referendum on a state law that was passed in 2018, SB 10, which eliminated bail and substituted a formula for determining the extent of an arrestee's threat to the public. That law didn't go into effect pending this referendum, Proposition 25. Marisa, this is quite unusual for us to be voting on something like this. And this also splits, like our previous one, splits people that typically would be allied on criminal law reforms.
Yeah, so before I get into that, let me just back up and say what SB 10 did and what it will do if voters uphold Prop 25. So this is really confusing, but a yes vote means you want to keep this law that was passed 2 years ago, and no vote means you want to overturn it. Essentially, what SB 10 said is that bail is unfair. It looks at whether people have enough money, not whether they're actual public threat or whether they're going to show up for their court date or not, that it benefits the rich over the poor. And really, and I did a lot of reporting on this at the time, ends up leading to people making really terrible choices, because if you are stuck in behind bars awaiting trial, you could lose your job or your home or your kids, custody of your kids. You might plead guilty to something that you're not guilty of because you just want to go home. So on the left, there's a pretty big sort of agreement that bail is not a good thing. And this was funded by the bail industry to get this on the ballot. They do want to keep their industry in place. What it would replace bail with, you kind of mentioned, these risk assessments. Each county would be responsible for adopting it. It's kind of an algorithm that looks at a lot of data and says, you know, Larry, you are in this age group, you live in this place, you've had a job for this long, this is your criminal record. We think on a scale of, let's say, 1 to 5, that you are a 1 and you should go home. But the judge would ultimately have the same power they do now to really make that call, right? And so I think that this is really what we're talking about here are people who are accused of kind of mid-level felonies. People accused of misdemeanors under this law would automatically be booked and released home. People accused of pretty violent felonies would be kept behind bars as they await trial. It's that middle section. And what some folks in the kind of civil rights group, Human Rights Watch, for example, I talked to them about this, object to is this idea of both an algorithm determining someone's risk and then the power that a judge would have to keep somebody preventatively behind bars. They think this could lead to more people being in jail as they await trial. Supporters say that's not true. They point to a PPIC study, among others. And I think that the interesting thing here, kind of to the privacy one, is that it's become this debate among folks on the left, and the bail industry is really benefiting from that because they're not really out here talking about it, even though they funded the measure to get this on the ballot. And they, along with some law enforcement groups, are really the one who are pushing to overturn this law.
Marisa, you beautifully laid that out. That's so clear. But I do want to give Fernando, you and Mike a chance to just briefly weigh in, but that's a great summary.
So I'm actually not going to weigh in on the substance of it. I'm going to say it's a referendum, unlike the initiative. It's basically like a recall of a law. And what's nice about this is you're just recalling that law. You can still create other laws. And it's a much better system from my perspective than the initiative. But we typically do the initiative because then you win all out. And so I'll stop there. But she did a great job of explaining it. Yeah.
All right, Mike, quick comment to close us there.
No, I agree. I mean, I think, the discretion the judges are going to have is really important. The algorithm and the fact that civil rights organizations are opposed to a proposal that in some ways is supposed to make it better for affected poor and minority communities, I think says a lot and points to the fact that probably we should be repealing this law and revisiting how we handle that bail process.
I want to thank our.
I do think the one unanswered question is whether the referendum would prevent the legislature from eliminating bail in the future. There's some case law that indicates that they can't take up the same question after voters have overturned it. And so that is something for people to think about.
Fascinating legal point there. I want to thank all of you. Wonderful job going so fast with all of these 12 ballot propositions. Joining us, Marisa Lagos, KQED, with those final words. Also with us, Laurel Rosenhall of Cal Matters, the nonprofit statewide news organization, Fernando Guerra, Loyola Marymount University, and Michael Shires of Pepperdine University. We thank you so much for joining this. And for those of you who are with us on our live in-person event, we're going to be taking your questions and turn to our panel to do that right now. So we've got about 10, 15 more minutes to take questions on our voter cram session. So let me go to those. Let's see. Chloe says, in regards to Proposition 15, will private residences also have changes in their property taxes? And Chloe, no, this would not apply, as I understand it. Proposition 15 being the split roll to people's own personal residences. But you want to comment on that one, Marisa?
Yeah, that's correct. This is aimed at commercial properties. It does have a provision that says an owner who owns commercial properties worth more than $3 million. So somebody could potentially own more than one property, and the sum of those would add up and trigger this reassessment. But absolutely, this should not apply to people's personal homes and anything that is not meant for a commercial purpose.
All right, Chloe, thank you. Sandy asked, does anyone know how the writings in the voter guides get chosen? Who can write a rebuttal response? Who can write an argument for or against? Laurel, is that something you'd be willing to weigh in on?
I believe it's the campaigns. It's the organized yes and no campaigns from each side. If anyone knows anything otherwise, please chime in.
Yeah, Fernando, can you elaborate at all on that?
So typically you have the sponsors of the initiative and they get to do the pro side, and then certain people respond against it. And then it's up to the Secretary of State and the Attorney General to determine who would do it. So it's not an organized effort. It's always not very clear. And you can sometimes even have multiple people. So it's not limited to just one opponent being on the rebuttal or argument for it.
All right. Jennifer wants to go back to Proposition 15, the split roll property tax initiative. Multifamily residences, apartment buildings essentially count as commercial when applying for a loan. So would that change in the tax basis, the higher property tax affect apartment buildings? I think this goes back to what Marisa was saying about the $3 million, and that's for a single owner. So as I understand it, Mike Shires, do you want to add anything on that?
Well, the intent was to exclude residential homes. In terms of apartment buildings, it's a little ambiguous the way the language is written in there, whether court rulings in the future would exempt them or include them because of that original intent on residential properties. Marisa might have a better sense of the details, but my understanding is that the intent is to exclude that, but for apartment buildings, it is possible that they will be part of it.
And yeah. Marisa, my understanding was if it's someone holds over $3 million worth of property, then that counts as commercial ownership. Is that right?
I believe so. And I think, you need to look at, if there's a big real estate organization that owns multiple apartment buildings, that's probably going to be different than somebody who owns just one. Although with property values, what they are in California, that $3 million threshold probably isn't that difficult to hit. But, I think that what this is really aiming to target, if you ask proponents, would probably be bigger commercial properties. Think the downtown areas, think, these huge corporations who have managed to kind of really, I think no matter whether you support or oppose Prop 15, kind of play with the code in a way so that they have been able to keep ownership kind of limited, ownership changes limited, and really suppress those rates over time, even if, they've changed owners and other commercial activity has happened.
We have Chris who asks about Prop 21. Can anyone provide data that shows that rent control helps on the cost of housing? I'm desperate to do something about the cost of housing here, but every study I've read, this is Chris writing, says rent control does not work. Fernando, you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I mean, he's absolutely right. Now, most of the studies that have said that have been funded by business groups, against rent control. But it's a good theory. I mean, I think the theory is strong that the more constraints you have in terms of making money, the less you're going to make that investment. On the other hand, this is way beyond an economic argument for private sector. It's about civil society and housing, given the homelessness. Something has to be done. Whether this is the right issue or not is yet to be seen, but certainly rents are way too high. We have too many renters, not enough homeowners. Government has to do something about that.
Well, and Mike Shires, I mean, it's undeniable, right, that if you're living in a residence that's rent controlled and you couldn't afford to pay market rate, that is a huge impact on that individual renter.
It is. And I mean, you go to places like New York City, which have very aggressive rent controls, and you could will it to your children, right? I mean, it's one of these assets that you want to hold on to. The people who get the controlled units win. Everybody else who's trying to find a place to live can't find one, and so they end up paying even more. So, I mean, in some ways, it's a redistribution between winners and losers.
Laurel or Marisa, you want to add anything, either one of you, to this question that came from Chris? No? Okay. Let's take the next question. Zora asks, whether we like it or not, Prop 23 is on the ballot. I understand it maybe shouldn't be on the ballot, but it is. So how would you advise us to vote? Well, Zora, we're trying not to have our experts, they're sharing their opinions. We don't want to tell you how to vote. And just to refresh, Proposition 23 is the kidney dialysis center one. The second one that organized labor has put on the ballot, it would require a physician, with some exceptions, to be in attendance at dialysis centers. Mike Shires, do you want to respond in some way to what Zora's asking?
I think there was a consensus that the initiative may not be the best way to set this policy. And so, I mean, you can interpret whether this initiative is the right vehicle to do that and what that means for your vote. But I think that it creates a landscape that isn't responsive to the industry and to changes in public health. I mean, as we see the public health sector redefined by COVID. So I think that's the best answer we can give.
Fernando, you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'll defer to Laurel right now.
I would just say that, and I'm not advocating people vote any one way or the other, but something that can help people determine how they might feel is that this is another labor management dispute on your ballot, with labor unions asking for a yes vote and the companies that own the dialysis clinics asking for a no vote. So for some voters, those facts can help them decide where they line up. But it is true that this is a labor union that has a real track record of using the ballot to sort of, in the process of its negotiations, is a union that wants to organize the workers at these clinics, and has been in a longstanding dispute with the owners of the clinics over that. And so these initiatives are getting kind of all the voters tied up in that dispute.
I mean, it's a difficult, so I consider myself a liberal. If all I knew was what Laurel just told me, that it was union versus big companies, I would probably vote in favor of the unions. But in this particular case, the unions, from my perspective, are really abusing and distorting the initiative process, which should be reserved for people, not specific organizations, to gain a specific gain that they couldn't do at the management or organization. I mean, if they were really great at unions, they'd be able to organize very effectively and unionize. They shouldn't have us unionize for them. And many people are going to say, well, you're not necessarily pro-union by those statements. I think I am, but I'm also much more pro-democracy, pro-initiative, and this just distorts it. Not that the $2 billion companies, I mean, the two companies that they're going after make over $1 billion a year. And so they are at fault by not taking care of their workers. I agree, but this is not the way to fix that.
Sharon asks, what is the difference between an initiative and a referendum? Mike Shires, do you want to answer that?
Sure. So there's actually three kinds of things. An initiative has two forms. One is I want to propose a law that the legislature hasn't proposed, and we see a lot of those on the ballot. Another one is I want to change the state constitution, so you have what's called an initiative constitutional amendment. Those are two ways that citizen groups can collect signatures and actually propose new laws or amendment to the Constitution. A referendum says the legislature passed a law that we don't like and we want to repeal it. And so Prop 25 is one of those. Basically, we passed SB 10. It's been put on hold because they collected enough signatures for the people of California to vote and decide whether we want that to be our law.
Just to remind you, that's the doing away with bail and using the algorithm to determine release or not. We have another question from Brian regarding Proposition 14. This is the $5.5 billion bond measure for stem cell and neurological research. It says, does anyone know how much, if any, money the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine has generated for California? What has been the return on investment for the first round of funding? Laurel, do you want to? I don't know what the exact amount is myself. But.
Yeah, let me see if I have.
I've heard, I think it's around $500,000 in royalty fees. So they had said that could be far higher at the time, that we first voted on this, but I think it's been around $500,000.
Thanks, Marisa.
Yeah.
It's not significant.
Yeah.
It's not. When you look at the $3 billion investment.
You two always make a good team. That's nice to see. All right. Proposition 20, Jeff is asking about it. Someone said the legislature should take this up with at least two other ballot measures on the subject. Isn't the legislature prohibited from making any significant changes without voter approval? I just throw that out. Who wants to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, largely,
Marisa?
although,
Yeah.
Again, because this is such a grab bag, there are things in it the legislature could address. They're not going to politically because most lawmakers are on the more liberal side of the Democratic Party. And this is really being pushed by a couple moderates, but more by, I would say, Republicans and law enforcement. I do think it's worth noting that, Mike earlier mentioned things like, that this would change the list of what's considered a technically violent crime under state law. That's a long-standing list that actually predated some of these ballot measures. And I think it's a little misleading to act as if, I'm not saying Mike is doing this, but I think there's this sense of like, well, if rape of an unconscious person is not on that list and you're not considering it violent. Violent crime has a really specific sort of definition under statute. And so it's not to say that if somebody was convicted of that crime that they, didn't go to prison because they're in prison for it. And I also think it's worth noting that within that question, the parole board is looking at the largely whole of this person's background. So it's not to say that if you committed one of these crimes, you automatically would get out early under current law. It is considered by the parole board that is largely made up with law enforcement. But to the question, yes, a lot of what they're trying to do here is not something that the legislature could legally change because voters have already weighed in. And I think it's worth noting that the reason a lot of these things went to voters is because the legislature just refused to touch these very controversial questions around criminal justice reform. And, one thing we didn't mention earlier, I think that's important, is the reason a lot of these ballot measures were written, Prop 47, Prop 57, realignment, AB 109, which was a legislative measure, was because we were under a Supreme Court order to reduce our prison population. And the Supreme Court essentially looked at California and said, you can either do that the way you guys want to do it, or we'll just tell you to start releasing folks wholesale. And so I think there is a healthy debate happening within the campaign about how much this would increase the population in our prisons and jails, and whether that would undermine some of the progress we've made in complying with that court order.
Laurel, did you want to add something to that?
Well, yeah, it's not specific to Prop 20, but just more broadly that a lot of the measures that are on our ballot, we've been talking about all night, they are tweaks, repeals, or repeats of something that was on the ballot before. And so I have felt that in evaluating this whole ballot, that there's just a major sense of deja vu, whether it's, kind of going back and revisiting something from 20 years ago or from 2 years ago. And part of that is because it's baked into the law. Once something is approved by the voters, it can't be changed by the legislature unless that's written into the thing that the voters approved. So we do a little bit have this sort of snowball effect of ballot measures that I think is very cumbersome and challenging for voters.
Let me,
Larry, can I say something?
Fernando, of course, yeah.
In very general terms, not to put. I think people have to vote early. It's very important to vote early. We're all getting a vote by mail. And I think most of us already know who we're going to vote for president, for Congress, sometimes for state legislature. What's happening is these propositions tend to be the ones that make us procrastinate because we want to learn more about it. And so if you're watching this, this is awesome. And that's what you need to do, is educate yourself about these so you can vote early about these. I always think that it's the propositions that hold people back from voting early. And I would recommend that you rewatch this show, but also to go to Cal Matters. They have a fabulous website that really talks a lot about this and has who supports it and the money, and then also further background to answer a lot of these questions that people are asking.
Well, that's a terrific note for us to end on, Fernando. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And also just want to remind everyone that we will be re-airing this on KPCC's AirTalk Thursday morning at 11 o'clock, the audio of this special in-person event that we've done tonight. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in and going through the voter cram session. I've learned a lot again from our experts, and I hope you have too. And of course, you'll be able to study much more with the KPCC voter game plan, as well as with all the in-depth debates we've done on AirTalk on every one of these 12 ballot measures. So you get the overview like we've done with this, and then of course the more in-depth too. So I just want to thank all of you, Mike, Fernando, Marisa, Laurel. Thank you so much for doing this with us. We really appreciate your expertise and your time. And from all of us at KPCC in person, thank you and have a terrific evening.